Hello everyone, and welcome back to Inside ArtScroll, where the books you read and the people who write them come to life. Today I am privileged to be joined by Rabbi Meyer Yedid, about whose father, Hacham Yom Tob Yedid, ArtScroll has just released a fantastic new biography called For the Sake of Heaven. Thank you, Rabbi Yedid, for joining us. There's so much to talk about this book because it encompasses so much. It encompasses history. It talks about your father's fascinating life, his strength of character, how he raised a community. So I guess let's start for our viewers who don't know much about your father's biography. If you could give a brief background into who he was and what he accomplished, and then we'll get into really some interesting things that I want to ask you about.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to be back here. My father was, Alav Shalom, was a great man who had a history probably different than most rabbis today, just because of where he was and the situation that he was in. He was born in Halab in Aleppo, Syria. At the time that he was born, the community was pretty full, a lot of people, thousands and thousands of families, but it was at a time also when people started to move out, leaving to the Western Hemisphere. And he was raised as a regular Jewish Syrian boy, and at a young age he connected to Torah and learning, and he stayed in the Bet Midrash. And there were different influences in his life that tried to take him out of learning. At that time, it wasn't so popular for young men to continue learning, but he did so, even though his entire family definitely did not, and eventually they left. They went to live in Israel. But he stayed alone, actually, and he continued his learning under his rabbi. His Rebbe was Rabbi Moshe Tawil, Alav Shalom, was a great man, and my father, Baruch Hashem, has a tremendous head, and he's a very strong-minded person, and he dedicated himself to Torah learning. Now, I'm telling you things that I didn't witness, and I didn't really know myself until I read the book.
Now, you were born in...
I was born in Syria.
In Syria, but you were...
50 years later.
Uh-huh.
He was born in 1923.
Right.
26.
Okay.
And I was born.
But he became rabbi in 1958 or so, right?
Something like that.
Somewhere in the 1950s, at the age of 32.
Right. As a young,
he became the chief rabbi of Aleppo.
Right. And I was born in 1973.
Okay.
So I didn't really see him definitely when he was younger. That's obvious. But I didn't see him either in his prime time, we'll call it. And also, he wasn't a person of words. Right. So it wasn't like he sat around the table and told us about where he grew up and what happened. So a lot of this book really opens up history, not only in his life, but in the life of the entire community. Mm-hmm. That even for someone like me who was born there, I never heard about it. I didn't know.
Right.
So I was so close to it, but really so far.
I think that's why the book, Mrs. Devorah Glicksman, who wrote it, and she did an unbelievable job.
She did a great job.
Phenomenal.
She worked 5 years on it.
I was going to ask you how long, because it records not only a documentation of his life, but really a piece of history. If anyone wants to know about what the Syrian community was like, mid-1900s, you open up this book and it gives you the historical context with Israeli history and how it impacted the community. You really learn so much. And we've been saying here at ArtScroll in our meetings that this book really reads like a novel. It's not your typical biography. There's so much intrigue and drama, and you go from page to page. You don't want to put it down. One of the things that I noticed, and I want you to talk about it, is that your father, he was a loving Rav, and he cared about the people, but he was a kanoi. By every measure. Did you know him as a son to a father? Did you know him as that tough, strong-minded individual?
So with his family, he wasn't really like that.
Okay.
He definitely was a strong-minded person, and you saw that in his way of life, but he didn't get too involved with our life in that way, where he would be strong and fire when it came to Torah and if things weren't happening correctly in the community. When it came to his own family, he was much more off a little bit, I guess, to let us be. In fact, something I always say, the musar to my students when they're getting married, I said, my father was a strong-minded person, and he did get involved. And even when we were young, he did get involved, obviously when he had to. But once we got married, never
hands off.
Hands off. Never got involved. Never said a word to us. It was only answering questions if he's asked. Never told us what to do. And I guess looking back, that was part of his chachma, that he understood that especially rabbis' children, you have to keep back a little bit and let them find their way.
I think that's even more incredible to hear, because here you read the book, he clearly possessed an unbelievable strength of character to stand up, and you described how he was alone. He really was alone in Syria with really no one to turn to, and I'll touch on that in a second. But you're a rabbi today of Sharei Tzion, tremendous congregation. Could you ever imagine trying to pull some of the things that he pulled in Syria? It wouldn't fly in 2020.
First of all, it wouldn't fly, so it may not be the right thing to do.
Right.
When you read this book, some parts of it you'll say, whoa, what was he thinking?
That's intense.
Yeah, how could he do that?
Right.
But you have to imagine that it's a different generation. It's a insulated community that had clear boundaries and guidelines, which for the most part we don't have today. And it was one man running the show. It was one man who had to take care of the yeshiva, of the Talmud Torah, of the weddings, of the Brit Milahs, of any shilas that came up. It was only him. So I also try to imagine running what I'm doing without any real. Today we have so many poskim. We have people who do shechita. There are people who do milah. There are people who are doing so many different things. And here you have a person who really is responsible for every single thing that goes on in the community, religious and even not necessarily the religious things.
Right.
So it's a tremendous achrayut.
It's really amazing. The book describes how he didn't have many rabbis to turn to at certain stages. When he was young, surely not. Sfarim were very limited. And yet, you also, I've seen a video that about your father where you describe that after his patira, you found ksavim, writings from him on virtually every segment of Torah with remarkable scholarship. So he was a goin, a world-class Talmud Chacham, and yet, when you read the book, you see that he didn't have exposure to many svarim, so somehow he pulled off the impossible. What's the answer?
So they had svarim, obviously. They had the basic svarim. They had, Talmud, and they had Shulchan Aruch, and they had the Torah, and they had the basic Rishonim. They had this svarim. But yes, there wasn't a kollel of 100 people learning, certainly not on his level of learning, which is something amazing. Like you mentioned, I try to imagine how a person by himself, more or less, is able to have the koach, the energy, and the ability to learn Yomam V'Layla, especially with the community and all of its responsibilities on your head. I mean, we found books and books and books on every subject. And, the books weren't written to be printed. That was never his kavanah. My father had a tremendous amount of clarity. That was his biggest chidush. That when you learn something, you chazer it, you see all his notebooks, all review, and clarity. Give over with clarity. And that's how he learned. It is hard to imagine how someone could do that.
And he clearly didn't care about popular opinion. I mean, he did things that went against the grain. He wasn't looking to win friends. There are countless stories like that. One story I was reading today was about how there was a group of students, I believe, and you tell me if I have it right, group of students who were going to be taking a matriculation exam. He wanted to make sure that they wouldn't take it on Shabbos.
Right.
And he basically made them swear.
Which was their only option.
Only option.
It was a very big nisayon. They were preparing years for that. It was their whole future.
Right, the whole future. Their whole parnasa would come based on how they would do on the exam. He wanted to make sure they wouldn't take it, and he made them swear that they wouldn't take it. And there were, I think, 3 students who didn't show up to actually commit that they wouldn't take the test on Shabbat, and he kind of pushed them out. He said, if you're not swearing, then you can't be part of this group. And he obviously knew with Chachma that he had to do that in order to protect the community. If he had allowed their influence to trickle in, it might have compromised the quality of Yiddishkeit of the other students. Nowadays, in our contemporary chinuch, probably the approach would be to makar of those boys. And I'm just pointing out, you see how
Different worlds
and different approaches, and you'll learn a lot. That there was a time and place for that type of chinuch, and today, we do
Obviously.
have a different type of approach.
Well, we have to, we live in a world of the melting pot of Jews in the world. There's the religious Jew, there's the non-religious Jew. He's also a type. There's the Zionist Jew, and then there's the Haredi Jew, and then but we have to remember that in Halab, which was really, this book is great because it describes a community very recent that I believe for thousands of years every community was like that. Mm-hmm. They were living in their city. Mm-hmm. They had their Rav. They had their things. They didn't have any communication really with other cities. It was insulated, and there were expectations as a member of the community of how you behave as a Jew. So you have to imagine, in all of Halab, Aleppo, there was nobody who was Mechalel Shabbat. Mm-hmm. In the open, no one would do that. That would be called leaving the community. Everybody came to shul to pray. Now, not everybody was a tzaddik, but there was no such intermarriage. They'll tell you maybe they'll remember one in 100 years. So it was a community that was really shamur. It was kept pure through the generations, as many communities have been through the years. What we're seeing recently really is the chidush. Recently we're seeing the Jewish world really all over the place, and we have to kind of find how to bring everybody closer. But in those types of communities where you had such a purity to the community, sometimes you had to do things which were painful to keep that purity there.
And the Syrian community, among its many attributes, is their respect for Rabbanim. And you see that in the book. If the rabbi says it, you don't mess with the rabbi. It's one of the many lessons that I learned from the book. And I'm curious from your standpoint as a son, and we spoke previously, I know when you were younger, you probably didn't imagine that you'd be where you are today, carrying such responsibility and really carrying on your father's legacy. Which part of this book, things that maybe you didn't know before Mrs. Glicksman wrote it, do you take chizuk from as you're leading your own flock and say, you know what, my father did that, I could really apply it in my position today?
So I didn't think about that, but as you're asking the question, one of the things clearly that stand out in my mind is that my father, no matter what he was doing in his life, was learning Torah, no matter what. When he was younger, that's all he did. When he was chief rabbi of thousands and thousands of people, and he had so many responsibilities, he was learning Torah, whether it was, he used to get up 3 a.m. to have a Seder before Shachrit, late at night, writing. There was no Ben Hazmanim, in Aleppo. They went from Rosh Hashanah to Rosh Hashanah. There was no Ben Hazdarim. There was no such vacation time. And he was learning no matter what. And then when later on in his life where his duties were different because he moved to America, it was a whole new chapter in his life. He didn't want to be involved in American rabbinate, which, as when you read the book, you understand why he didn't want to, because it just wasn't his style, and it wasn't the way he understood things needed to be done. He knew things had to be done differently here, but he couldn't do it. Mm-hmm. And he dedicated his entire day and night, 7 days a week, every single week, every single month, for 30 years, just learning.
Just learning. And he did it like the book is called, L'Shem Shemayim. There were no accolades. No one was praising him for it. No. It wasn't like he was impressing anyone, because the people around him didn't necessarily exemplify that type of approach.
Right. They weren't coming to hear a great shiur and a sugya. Yeah, they weren't hearing. Right, exactly.
Which is what makes it even more amazing.
It's unbelievable.
And I read in the book also how he was not going to simchas. He went to even a family simcha, maybe 10 minutes, and then he was back home learning, right? That
Well,
was.
that's it.
Could you imagine such a thing today?
It's
It's an
no,
unbelievable
no,
thing.
That's an unbelievable thing.
Really.
So when I think of myself as, I feel I'm pretty busy in my life as well. But if you don't learn, if you're not learning, so you're losing all your koach. Whatever he accomplished and whatever he's, the message of this book to me is that you just learn when you can. Whether it's 3 hours, 6 hours, whether you're the biggest Rav, whether you're doing nothing in your life, you just learn. And you just see how Hashem gives beracha to everything that's happening when you're there and even after you're there. So many things today are happening in our family, in our community. Not only in New York, he had students all over the world from the Aleppo community that you see such beracha in their life. And to me, I can't give all the credit to my father, but one of the key ingredients is that there was a man who sat and learned Torah. He taught it when he could, but his chief and most important job was to learn. And to me, that's the power of this book, to show how learning can just add up to things you never thought about, you never dreamt of.
Right. When he came over to America, do you remember what kind of nachas did he have watching the growth of Limanat Torah? It must have been for him someone who personified Limanat Torah under all circumstances, to be able to witness the growth of the Torah community for someone like him who cared about nothing but making Hashem proud. It must have been a tremendous source of nachas to him.
So, when he came to this country, he really took an active step of not getting involved in anything. But clearly, you see from his conversations that he was just amazed by the Mir Yeshiva, that was down the block from where he learned every day. He would say statements like, the Talmidei Chachamim, the Bnei Torah that are here, are the source of our hatzlacha. They're the source of our strength. And he definitely appreciated Talmidei Chachamim. When they came from Israel, they would talk and learning, they would ask him questions. So he had a tremendous appreciation for Torah learning. I don't even know if he knew the scope of it. Like he never went to Lakewood. He knew about Lakewood. He supported, people learning and all that. But he was so insulated that I don't know if he knew the scope of it. But whatever he knew, clearly was a new taste for him.
The book itself also talks about your candidness, about your own growth. It's very interesting towards the end of the book as you describe how you yourself grew and were inspired. Talk about that for a second, because I think people will appreciate how you were open about your own aliyah and Torah and who influenced you.
Right. So, I came into this country. I was 9 years old, and I came actually before my father. He came a year after. In Syria, it wasn't.
It wasn't so simple.
Yeah, I mean,
right?
the book will tell you how we're an example of one family, but there were many, many thousands of families like us, where we're 9, and at one point we were all over the
world.
The world.
And you never knew if you would be united.
Yeah, I never met my brothers, 2 of them, till I was 10 years old. Never knew them because they had left. So we were all over the place. We were not together at all. So I came into this country, and it was a totally different world than the country I came from. The values were different, the heroes were different, and it was just hard to fit in. Just the language, I didn't know how to speak. But more than that, it was just a different world. And I came with my parents, and my parents were like these people from the Stone Age,
right. The old world.
The old world, they knew nothing about what was going on. So you kind of, in your mind as a little boy, kind of shelve them and say, these people are not really so relevant. They don't really understand what life's about. They don't really know what happiness is. They don't really know what success is. I mean, what does my father know? He sits and learns all day. What does my mother know? And you grow up thinking that. And you have the heroes of the American society, whether it's the guy singing or the guy shooting basketballs and that that trickles down to the community as well, where people. So all of a sudden, you want to fit in, and you want to be that, and you want to be that person that everyone is looking up to, and that's the way I grew up. Baruch Hashem, I had a good head. I knew how to learn. In that time there wasn't that many yeshivas anyway in our community, but I would say it was light. It was always keeping the Torah mitzvot, but it wasn't.
So what was the turning point for you?
The turning point, I would say, and I always tell the boys that I'm pretty open about it, that I think at a certain age, maybe at the age of 20, I started to see, I don't know how Hashem, maybe because of the schut of my father, just put me in situations that the very people I looked up to, whether they were friends that I thought were the people
the spitz,
or whether it was families. I didn't grow up with money. I didn't. We were simple people, and these people had a lot of money. Those were the people I looked up to, and they were those. In a short period of time, I started to open my eyes and realize that the guy I was looking up to, he's not really doing much in his life. He's not so happy. The family I thought was the spitz of the families. They don't really they're yelling at each other. They don't get along with their children. And all of a sudden I'm looking at my parents. They raised 9 beautiful children that all love each other. Wow. And there's no screaming in our home. There's no fighting in our home. And then I started realizing, my parents probably know a lot more than I thought. And all of a sudden, you start seeing the chokhmah, and then you start looking, and you say, wow, I messed up. They know a lot more than I thought they did.
Wow.
So, I guess in short, that would be the basic story of it. And then I got to appreciate more who my father was and who my family is.
Now, the people hopefully will buy the book, and they're going to read it. What's your hope as far as what inspiration that they could take? Maybe we won't become the Talmud Chacham that your father was. We probably won't become a Rav of a community at age 32 and things like that. But what overriding lesson or two, and maybe a particular story that you think will inspire people?
I think that, first of all, a person must learn how to adjust in life.
And I should say, obviously the lesson of Limud HaTorah, which you mentioned before,
right,
which you said inspired you.
Right.
But in addition to that, what practical lessons?
I think adjustments in life are an important lesson here. When you go from being the Chief Rabbi, where nothing happens in the city without your signature, nothing happens in that city without you. And now you come to a new world. And now that's not relevant anymore. And maybe you don't become so relevant as that type of authority.
Quite humbling.
Yeah, so what happens to you? I think for most of us, we will be thrown back, and he says, okay, now I got to adjust. Now I can learn more. Now I can do something else. This is a new chapter in my life. Sometimes we get stuck in who we were and who we want to be. But I think one of the lessons here is that you should just be where Hashem puts you. And wherever He puts you, doesn't matter what you were, doesn't matter what you wanted. Right now, this is where you should be, and maximize it. So I think that's a very big lesson in that. I think, let's see, what else could I tell you that would stand out? What would I want someone to walk away with?
I'll humbly offer that, and this is obvious, that he had the courage of his convictions, even when it was unpopular. And I wonder if that's a message that would resonate with the youth of today. They're surrounded by a culture that tells them one thing, and we try to teach them a different thing. And sometimes it's hard when you're the minority and everything around you looks exciting. What Hacham Yom Tob taught us in an amazing way that we'll never really understand, because his challenges were so far beyond anything we will ever have to encounter, hopefully, was just to stand strong in your beliefs.
Absolutely. You said it. You said it beautifully. I can't believe I missed that. That's really one of the most powerful things. That you're right. That we're not going to stand up and say things in public in certain ways that, again, they just don't fit today. Right. But we have our own situations where we also need courage. That sometimes we have to just stand up and do the right thing. We may not have to be vocal about it, but very often we get scared of doing the right thing because what will that person say? Or what will that person, they have money, so they may not give me money now if I say this or if I do that.
Exactly.
And
I'll just mention in the book, your father says at least once where he said when he wanted to make an example, he said, I'm not going to pick on the poor guy of the community because people won't care. He was going to make an example out of the prominent person, the rich person, because then people will realize that he meant business. You know, he wasn't trying to impress the prominent people. He was going to do what was right. And
right. So I think you're right. I mean, for each individual, how many decisions do we make on a daily basis where we're thinking who's looking over our shoulder and what's their take going to be and what's their comment? And of course, we have to be sensitive to people's opinions and their feelings, but that should never hold us back from doing God's will and doing the right thing. And even if we're not going to be vocal about it, but we need to do it. We need to be strong and not to be afraid.
I have no doubt that your father is looking down, he's shepping tremendous nachas from what you've done, your impact on your yeshiva, on your kehillah. It's really unbelievable. I'm inspired by what you do, and we hear about how your mispalim talk about your influence. You're clearly carrying on his legacy in your own way, with your own derech. There's no doubt that he's shepping nachas, and Amidst Hashem, people are going to read this book, and they'll be inspired in their own way, as I have been reading the book, and others who have read it. So we thank you for enabling the publication of this book. It's clearly going to enhance people's emunah, their bitachon, their strength and belief in what we believe in. So thank you, Rabbi Yedid, for whatever you've done to make this book happen, and thank you for coming in for a few minutes to talk about it.
I'd like to add one more thing.
Sure.
Maybe you could include it as well. In that I think one of the big lessons from my father, Alav Shalom, is that he took every student into his mind in every decision that he made. He wanted to make sure that no student would fall. He worked countless hours in the yeshiva to make sure every boy knew how to read. Every boy knew the basics, at least. We'll always have Talmidei Chachamim that rise. But he wanted to ensure that every boy and every girl would have a chance to live a Jewish life, and he went all out for that. So I think it's another...
I think it's a very important lesson, especially with the growth of our community and the growth of our Amidst. We might start taking for granted, there's so many kids, so if a couple fall through the cracks, not such a big deal. As you mentioned, your father never lost track of the Yachid, even as he was focused on the Klal. And I've mentioned it in conversations in this room. The great mechanchim and leaders never ever lose sight of the individual.
Right.
He
would test, believe it or not, every year, every kid in the entire school, personally.
And we read how he would hold the mechanchim accountable.
That's right.
If a kid wasn't doing well, he went over to the Rebbe and said, what's going on? How come last year he did well?
Right.
So we see that quite a bit in the book. And it's really fascinating.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.
I appreciate it.
Likewise.